Greetings, any loyal and, of course, all new listeners. This is Brian Freidenborg, and this is my inaugural podcast of the Real Context News podcast. Some of you may remember, probably not too many of you, but I did dabble in some podcasting years ago. And my last episode was mid-April 2016. At the height of the Democratic and Republican primaries. And I was making it clear that it was pretty obvious it was going to be Sanders and Trump. Sorry. Oh boy. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And I had made that call much earlier than that. But things got a little crazy after that. So I walked away from the podcast at a time when I was doing much better with my written articles and getting a lot more traction that way, so I decided to put my eggs in that basket. But here we are. It's now 4 years later, more than 4.5 years later, and we're in the midst of another presidential election. The primaries are now over. And for my inaugural podcast, to be associated with my new news website, Real Context News, that I started in early 2019, right at the beginning of the year, actually. We have a lot to talk about, and I'm not going to be getting into a tremendous amount of detail on any one topic, other than to say we're kind of going to be looking at the big picture here today. We're going to be looking at how the world has changed, how the United States has changed, what's going on since my last podcast 4.5 years ago. We're going to look into why that's happening, and we're going to be looking into not only the past and the present, but a bit into the future as well, to understand this moment that we're in, the history that's unfolding before our eyes, the history that we've lived through. I'll just flat out say right off the bat that as amazing as I think many individual journalists are, as hard as I think many outlets try to do, as honest as I do think most of the mainstream media tries to be. I've made this point many times before, and you're going to hear it more than once out of me throughout these podcasts, but they do a horrible job of stepping back, looking at the bigger picture, pausing and taking a breath to just comprehend and understand, to give you, the audience, any assistance in comprehending or understanding what's going on. And the analogy I've used is that essentially what the news does is takes puzzle pieces and just chucks them at you. Rapid fire. You're standing there looking at these pieces hitting you, bouncing off you, and then you're expected to look at what's falling around on the floor around you, all these random puzzle pieces, without too much of an effort to group or organize or piece them together. There is some, but not much. So they might throw you 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 pieces put together, and they might chuck that at you, but they're throwing them at you so fast, so furious, that they'll often break apart when they have been put together, or they'll fall next to other pieces, and it will look like maybe they're related, or maybe they could fit together, but they really don't. And while you're trying to look at some of this and figure out what's going on and maybe pick up some pieces and put them together yourself, you're getting more and more pieces thrown at you constantly. It never ends. And I will say this in fairness to these media organizations: we've never had this much crazy stuff happening at once, over and over again, constantly. You've had bits and pieces and periods of history where things have really picked up, but to have, and by never, I mean the modern media landscape, the last few decades. I mean, sure, during World War II, there was a million things going on, no question. Probably at certain phases during the Cold War. But in terms of global events and our domestic political situation, having so many things happening and unraveling at once, this is a pretty unprecedented era. I'm not going to say for world history, but again, for the modern era for us. So what I've been trying to do with my news website, Real Context News, that's realcontextnews.com, one word, or you could just search my name, Brian Frydenberg, and it'll come right up. And my name, the website, and other articles and things I mentioned, I will provide links I will provide links when I put this up so that by the time you're listening to it, you will be able to reference what you're hearing and pull it up and explore further. And I'm going to be facilitating that. And that's one thing I do with my articles. I've actually had people I know say, "Oh, your articles have too many blue links." And every time I hear that, I think to myself, that absolutely doesn't change your ability to read. It gives your mind the opportunity to quickly see where I got my information, where I got an idea, or see the source work of whomever I'm quoting. It gives you the ability to go to the source much more so than most other articles you're going to read. So that's one thing that sets my my work apart in terms of what I'm trying to do with my website is the context and the amount of sources and the references I include. I try to make them higher quality. I'm very careful about vetting, and I include many of them. And if I get one source to back up something I'm saying, but I also find 3 or 4 other high quality sources, I often will include those links as well. So you're going to get a better sourced experience, a better referenced experience, a more verified experience in terms of the information you're processing from my work. But you're also going to get a lot more context. And I'll be honest, my hat's off to these brave reporters going out to war zones and risking their lives, and to the other reporters who are still putting themselves out there here at home and in other places that aren't necessarily dangerous or as dangerous, but they're still out there getting the information and presenting it to the world. And without them, we wouldn't have this information. But there's an article I wrote called In Praise of Analysis, and it's all about what the news media can learn from the CIA, from the intelligence community. And that is, you got your field officers collecting the raw intelligence, you got satellites and other information, and other devices presenting raw material to us, stuff from the NSA, algorithms, programs, what have you. And all that information comes in, and especially to the human sources who are providing the information, and the field officers who are collecting and bringing that information into us, that is invaluable. We'd have nothing to do if it wasn't for the different venues and people collecting information. So I'm not downplaying that at all. I'm not trying to say that what I do is harder or more important in and of itself. What I am saying is that at a certain point, you have so much information coming in, you've got to have people that weight the information. What is more important? What is more consequential? What has more of an effect on what's going on? Which pieces of information are more valuable? Which should we focus on? Which should we emphasize? Which deserves more of our time and resources and less of our time and resources? And I have to say, this is something that the intelligence community does extremely well. They will prioritize, weight, present different levels of importance and urgency, and they will do a very good job of this. And the people getting the final product, they're getting the raw information put together by field operatives or given by field operatives, or coming in from the NSA or other technological instruments, listening instruments, programs, devices, satellites, what have you. But then you have the desk people at the CIA, at different intelligence agencies, who then they process all of this and then they sort it out. They make sense of it. They put it together. They rank it. They weigh it. They put historical context. They look at how previous information that the field officer isn't going to be busy focusing on because he's out there still collecting raw data, right? You got people back at the CIA and on different various desks for intelligence agencies putting all this information together they're not using their time and energy at that given moment to find new information or even process new information. They're saying, hey, this is what we got right now. Let's just put this together and let's go through this and let's see how this fits into both what we have already collected, what's being collected currently, and then we'll have that information there and we can see how in the future that fits into what will come in the future. But this is not what the media does a good job of doing. They actually do a pretty terrible job of doing. And what I used to say, or what used to happen, is our outlets like the New York Times would have a section, something along the lines of the Week in Review. That's what it was called there. And you would get in-depth analysis by like individual people about what had been put together by the news people early in the week. So you have your news people who are out there getting the information. They're not really putting their spin or their thoughts or their analysis in there so much as they're just presenting the information. Here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's why we know this and don't know that. But then you'd have at the end of each week various people, not just one person, putting together these things, often different people. And what's great about that is that they're responsible for kind of maybe putting, I don't want to say this is opinion, but really expert analysis that various people that the news reporters are out interacting with and getting the information from, they may not like these people that they're giving the information to, the reporters, they may not like what the analysis says. They may not like the conclusions that the expert professional analysts make. They may be offended, they may be angry, they may look at them as damaging to their careers or interests or projects. But you have a separation. This is key. What you have is a group of individual reporters taking the information, not passing judgment so much, not really putting together and analyzing in ways that may be to the detriment of the people they're getting the information from. So they're separating themselves. They're able to get information from these people with a level of trust that they're kind of not spinning things or putting their mark on it. They're just going to pass on the information, put together what they have to a degree, but really just it's the first draft of history. And then if they really don't like the second draft of history, the analysis people or the opinion people who are just, this is what I think, blah, 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 which I think is separate from analysis because analysis is much more deeper and tries harder to be more objective most of the time. But it shields the reporters from the displeasure or frustration or anger to a large degree from the people they're getting the information from. And that was healthy. You had this clear division between the reporters, the analysis folks, and the opinion folks. And that allowed a more open collection of information without the reporters having to worry about the wrath or the anger or being cut off. This is relatively speaking, of course, because they were letting other people put the things together, do the analysis, do the opinion. And the problem we're having now, and I think she's in many ways a fine reporter, she's certainly a serious person and puts a lot of effort into her work, but I will attack her as a poster child of this because she is at the paper of record, the New York Times. I'm talking, of course, about Maggie Haberman, but there's many other people. She basically has helped change the paper, and I don't blame it on her. It's the editors. It's the papers decide what pushback they give, what they allow reporters to do and don't do, right? So if they don't like the way a reporter is doing something, they'll tell them, you got to do better here, go back. But what they've done, and she's been in many ways a star reporter, the quote-unquote Trump whisperer, as she's been called, with her tabloid background and what have you, which she, and I would argue most domestic political reporters at this point now, but I would say that she was one of the most prominent early examples of this back in the 2016 election cycle, and I think a lot of people sought to emulate her, and I don't blame her for that, okay? I blame the powers that be that run these papers for that. But And of course, the pressures of the bond market and all that, but at some point you have to resist some of that more. And I think Dean Baquet, the editor, the main editor of the New York Times, is trying and fighting a losing battle with, as we saw what happened with James Bennett and the Tom Cotton piece and Barry Weiss. And we're going to get into all this stuff at some other point. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on that today. But essentially, what is happening now is that reporters are mixing their opinion and their analysis. And again, the way I would differentiate between opinion and analysis, opinion is just sort of, you're kind of riffing and giving your opinion, and it may not be terribly substantiated, but that's just sort of your perception, and you're just putting that out there, versus very, very substantiated, carefully thought analysis where you're really keeping your opinion out as much as possible, and you're saying, look, this is where the facts guide me, but then here's where my gut might guide me and other things, but my gut's not substantiated, but the facts, the research, the context are substantiating these conclusions I'm making. So essentially, I feel like opinions are, generally speaking, relative to analysis, opinions that are not terribly well substantiated versus ones that are well substantiated. So you have reporters mixing news, opinion, and analysis, and the thing is they'll write all three in the same tone. So what's presented as factual news is often also opinion and analysis, or has a lot of both of those mixed in. And this is a huge problem because in many ways it's destroying the credibility of the media industry, and Trump is playing this to his advantage. And I think there's a tremendous lack of self-awareness among many in the mainstream media class. And this is especially true at the New York Times and the Washington Post and other major outlets, but and that doesn't even get to the more independent, fringy, kind of intercept type things, which are essentially the propaganda of people like Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill, and just everything's going to be presented in a way, for the most part. And to be fair, there's people like James Risen and other serious reporters who actually try a little bit to be objective, but a lot of these more independent, quote-unquote adversarial journalistic outlets, they're really just pushing whatever advances what they want to advance. And there's very little pretense of even trying to be objective. But within the realm of papers that are trying to be objective, the New York Times is really, and again, they're under incredible pressure, but the mainstream press in general has started really mixing their opinion and thoughts. And at this point, look, I want to start by saying that racism is an absolutely horrible situation in the force in the United States. It's omnipresent. Sexism as well, and it's globally, it's often even worse. But so I'm not in any way saying that we shouldn't have more journalists of color. We do need, and more women. We need more representative voices, but not just checking off gender and skin color boxes, but socioeconomic boxes as well, and diversity of thought as well. But what we have is a lot of journalists that are even being encouraged to report this story as your background to a degree that's healthy, and we need that. But I don't think it's being done well. I think what's happening is a lot of reporters are simply inserting their opinion, and they're thinking, often among elite members of their own kind of group of people who share their particular, usually racial and ethnic background or gender background, that they represent, what Black people think or Hispanics think or women think. And they kind of approach their journalism, their straight up news reporting. I'm talking mainly about the domestic political reporting in the Times or the Post or what have you. But they're saying, I'm a young Black writer, I'm a young woman of color, and this is how I've heard my friends and my peers within my group react to this comment by Joe Biden or whomever, where there's a range of options, there's a range of ways to take certain comments. There's should be more of an effort to look at the overall context of say Biden's, who got horrible coverage during the primaries by almost all the mainstream outlets, but more of an effort to look at the context and history, not just the most salacious negative parts, but the totality of the context and history of a person and what they've done and said on these issues over the years, and what their comments mean in the context of their actual action that they have, their actions that they have taken, their corpus of speeches and comments. And instead, you get kind of younger people who are like, I'm sick of old white dudes, so, every time Biden says something bad, I'm going to present it in basically the worst possible light, and I'm going to put an undue amount of focus on how particular groups within groups will interpret these things. Because if you talk to older African Americans, who by far are much larger portions of the electorate, they don't get that miffed up about people misspeaking about things here and there. They care about people who have delivered for them, who have stood by them, who have fought for them over the years. They care about people like Joe Biden, who have been in the trenches, who have forged relationships with other activists like Jim Clyburn, Elijah Cummings, all kinds of various people that are pillars in the African American community and have been there fighting for years, not just some new reporter who's been increasingly popular for the last 5 or 6 years, and what that person thinks and how Joe Biden's comments are reflected by that person. That's not to dismiss these perspectives. They're important. We all need to grow and learn and change, including Joe Biden. But the point is, almost the entire primary coverage was what was of Biden from the mainstream press, was from how a particularly younger, more liberal, more radical sometimes segment of activist-minded, and I don't blame any of these people. If I was like a young Catholic reporter covering JFK in the 1960s, it would have been hard for me to stay objective. So what I'm saying is, you have these younger reporters who are quote-unquote part of this sort of woke crowd movement, and I'm down with the whole concept of wokeness, and I support it and agree with it and push to make sure I'm keeping up with the times and evolving as well. But I don't like that kind of term so much as I like the idea of just a person being generally sensitive to other perspectives, having an understanding heart and mind, an open heart and mind. I don't think we need a new term for wokeness. I think you just need people to, understand history, understand context, understand where they may have been more privileged because of certain aspects of their background, be it their skin color, wealth, connections, what have you, and to understand these different perspectives. So these different perspectives have to be presented, but they can't drown out what regular people think. And I don't mean regular people as in white people. I just mean like rank and file people. Because if you look at what all these very young woke reporters were presenting, you would have thought Joe Biden's got no chance. He's on his dying legs. Nobody wants this old white guy anymore. We want someone younger. We want Beto was hot for a while, but we want a Bernie Sanders. I know he's not younger, but he's more exciting and more radical. So we want Bernie. We want Kamala. We want Elizabeth. We want someone different and fresh that's not a white man. And this is what the people who purported to speak for African Americans, for women, but Biden was killing it with African Americans. He was killing it with women throughout the primary. And he did very well with Latinos relative to every other candidate other than Bernie. And he still did respectably in many cases with these people. Sadly, there are issues with polling Latinos. That's a whole discussion we could have another time. And because of coronavirus, you see that in states like Florida and other states, there just wasn't the quality and amount of people being interviewed by entry or exit pollers. They just weren't getting the same quality data they would get in a non-coronavirus pandemic situation. So we don't have as much data as we'd like on, say, Hispanic voters in Florida. Super Tuesday is one of the last days where we really get really good, solid, broken down information. So we might get a percentage of Hispanic voters in Florida, but we don't get them broken down by age, if you look at the exit polls, for example. But you see that in certain parts of the South, Biden did really well with young people, even better than Bernie did with young people of color in certain areas. But there's a lot of data that we sadly didn't get because of that. But it's these people are not monolithic. And anyway, I'm really going into a big cast here on the state of the news media, and I meant to be talking more about where we are. But I think it's important to understand this as we talk about where we are and where we've come to, because the media is as responsible for where we are as anything else. And the reason I was going into all this is that you have these kind of very elite group of college-educated people who've been, even if they came from a socioeconomic background when they were younger, before they made it to these more elite colleges and institutions, they're part of an elite now. And they have a very elitist, very left-leaning, often, I would say, neo-Marxist, in the sense that they may not use the term neo-Marxist, but I mean, essentially neo-Marxism is a broadening of the deconstructive approach that Marxism took to everything, but to include race, gender, other stuff, sexual orientation. And that's important. It's good to have these views, but it's the idea that pretty much everything needs to primarily be looked through. Andrew Sullivan refers to this and others as critical race theory and other critical theory prisms. But the idea is that, you got to start with that, and that's how you look at everything. And that's not how normal people think. That's not how non-college educated, or even a lot of college educated who are not particularly part of elite institutions or elite groups of people. So a lot of these younger reporters, be they white or people of color, men or women, they're coming from a very, very, very different perspective than the vast majority of quote unquote normal, non-elite people from those groups. So it's like the difference between Cornel West saying, I know he's older, but Cornel West or I'm trying to remember, well, there were a lot of younger people of color and younger white people who supported Jill Stein or Gary Johnson. Like, if you look at how black people voted overall, that's wildly unrepresentative of how many. I mean, we're talking a couple single digit points out of over, I think 87%, somewhere between 86 and 87, I think, percent of African Americans supported Clinton. So, Eddie Glaude is younger than Cornel West, but he's another Princeton professor guy, and he didn't vote for Clinton. It's like these people are taking these very elite stances, and they occupy important positions and contribute important things to the conversation. But the gap between, think about white reporters. Think about how few white reporters from the mainstream press actually got a pulse on what was going on with the Trump folks, so that there were going to be more of them coming out to vote, that so many more people in these rural areas were going to come out and skew the polls a little bit. They didn't call that. They were just not in touch with these people. So whether it's a young Latino activist, young Hispanic activist, young Asian activist, young white activist-minded reporters, these people they're just not in touch as nearly as much as they think, and they certainly aren't representative of how most people in their kind of group identity would think. And so this gets to what's been going on in our country the last few years. And the rise of Trump really was a perfect cocktail of a number of things. And I was one of the few people to really understand this early, as early as I did, because first of all, I was one of the few people who was worried that the Bernie supporters were going to be a huge issue in terms of bringing them on board to Clinton's side in the face of Trump. And I was one of the first people as well. There's a piece I wrote back in August 2015. August 2015 warning that Trump looked like he was in a damn good position to win the nomination, that he was certainly the favorite at that point, and that anybody who wanted to take him on was facing a series of challenges that were not well suited to them, but that Trump was well suited to exploit. So I was warning about Trump being an issue in August 2015, and I think it was March even, maybe it was April of 2016. I was really, really saying that the Bernie people and Bernie himself were going to be a huge issue. That they just seemed to not really want to play team ball at all. They wanted to be disruptive. They hated Clinton. Yeah, all right. So back in early February, actually, I was alarmed. I just pulled it up. I'll put this piece in as well. I was very alarmed at this sort of rise of this non-democratic party, far left kind of people that Bernie was activating, but not activating to really be part of, whoever got the nominations efforts, but he was really activating for his own agenda, not some nefarious evil thing, although I think tearing down the Democratic Party to try and remake it in your own image, when Donald Trump is the nominee and you absolutely are not going to succeed in tearing it down now because you lost pretty obviously by by late February. It was obvious what I wrote, and this is very well backed up by the way things played out, was that whoever was going to win South Carolina for the Republicans and whoever was going to win Nevada for the Democrats, that was it. Just, they were going to roll in the Super Tuesday and dominate, and that's exactly what happened. That South Carolina for the Republicans was going to be the last time anyone could prove and demonstrate that they had the ability to put together the type of coalition needed to win the Republican nomination, and the exact same thing for Nevada. Nevada was the last time Bernie was going to have to make his case to appeal to non-whites going into an incredibly diverse situation in Super Tuesday. And nobody did it with the Republicans. They failed to unite. There may have been someone that could have done it, but they just, all those little egomaniacs on the Republican side did not, nobody dropped out. Nobody really, for the most part, there was no plan. There was no consolidation. There's no, for all this talk of the establishment, the establishment didn't do anything really to consolidate. And that's what happened this time around in reverse with Joe Biden. What happened with Joe Biden this time is that the party rivals to him said, you know what, we're not going to win this. And all we're going to do is weaken Joe and strengthen Bernie if we stay in. So what the Republicans could not do to prevent a hostile takeover with a guy that was winning 25, 30% most of the time, if you look back at Trump's numbers before people really started dropping out, before Super Tuesday, and if you look at Bernie this time around, Nevada was the exception, but he's most of the time, he was getting mid-20s, high 20s, sometimes at best low 30s. It was obvious that we're going to have to consolidate, and that's what the Democrats had the humility and the sense to do that the Republicans did not do 4 years earlier. But they came together quickly, and you can actually look at my articles from this cycle where I'm basically saying, look, Biden should do really well in South Carolina, and if he does, and if people drop out, he'll be the nominee. And if people don't drop out, it's a matter of how much damage they do to him and the threshold of delegates in California. Because if Biden didn't get 15% in California and Bernie got pretty much every delegate there and all the other people had split, it would have been really hard to stop Bernie. But that's not what happened. So I wrote an article before South Carolina saying that Biden was looking pretty good as long as he did well in South Carolina, which it was almost certain he would. And then that some people would drop out, which I suspected would happen, and that did happen. And then before Super Tuesday, I was like, hey, everybody, this is over. But you won't find anybody else who was really writing either of those. Go Go to Google, look up news articles from that time, look up who was saying before South Carolina, Biden had a really good chance to be the nominee and should be considered, I basically broke down that there was a third chance that Bernie would get it, a third chance that would be really close, but that you had to favor Biden in that situation, and then a third of a chance that Biden was just going to run away with it. But that's essentially 2/3 of the situations where Biden was favored. And that was before South Carolina that I wrote that. And then before Super Tuesday, I was like, it's over, guys. So one of the only things that has given me hope is if you look at what happened in 2016, is that the Republican Party was remarkably craven and just pathetic. I mean, you look at Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump is literally calling his wife ugly and claiming his father had something to do with the JFK assassination. And how long was it before Cruz was there, more or less fawning over Donald Trump? How long did that take? And the one man who really, look at the spinelessness of people like Marco Rubio today, and the rest of the quote-unquote Republican Party, which at this point is I'm not trying to be snarky, I'm not trying to play to a liberal audience here or anything, but the Republican Party has ceased to be a respectable, serious political party, and it's a personality cult surrounding Donald Trump. Mitt Romney was one of the only people to vote to impeach Trump. I believe he was really the only one, now that I remember it. I'll have to double check that, but conversely, look at how, in the face of someone certainly more, I'm not equating Bernie and Trump, but they're, let's face it, folks, there are similarities to them in terms of their rhetoric of tearing down the establishment and everyone else is corrupt, but I'm the virtuous person who's going to lead the way, and we'll do it together, and we'll just run over the elites and blah, 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 blah. There's similarities, but the point is that 2 times now, and this time even more convincingly, the Democratic Party has rejected what many would look at as extremism on the left. And this time, even more emphatically, and it was emphatic in 2016, it was not even close. Bernie got about 40%, Clinton got about 56% of the, but what people forget is that there were 14 caucuses, and those overwhelmingly were undemocratic and favored Bernie disproportionately and unfairly, and almost all those caucuses were gone this time. So now Biden's gotten over 50%, and Bernie doesn't even have 27% of the vote this time around. So Bernie did dramatically worse this time than last time. So in other words, the Democrats rejected even by larger margins now the left-wingism, democratic socialism, whatever you want to call it, of Bernie Sanders. So in the face of these incredibly difficult times, the Democrats have rejected extremism. Pelosi pursued impeachment only after she had gotten a lot of really good, she didn't run on the first chance she could have on that. She was holding back. She took a more moderate course. However, her opponents want to, and the Republicans want to portray this. This was not some crazy witch hunt. This was very measured and careful. But what we've had is essentially the destruction of the Republican Party as we know it, turned into basically a cult, and the Democrats holding on, despite furious opposition from the left, to a sense of sanity, a realization that politics is about growing a tent, not shrinking it. And what I wrote back in 2016, May, was that when you looked at the way that the establishment and anti-establishment kind of discussion was going. I wrote, quote, "This tells us something very simple and very disturbing. American voters care less about experience and qualifications than they possibly ever have, and this trend is only increasing. Outsider, anti-establishment politics have become wildly popular and wildly successful." And then they go into how there were signs on both sides that this was coming. But time in and time out, or time and time again, I should say, the Democrats have shown themselves to resist extremism while the Republicans have embraced it. Ilhan Omar, who I wrote a piece defending her, and then she tweeted something pretty silly after I did that. But, she gets a lot of unfair heat, but she gets a lot of deserved heat as well. Like, she is who she is. I respect where she's coming from, and she comes from a very different background, and she's in many ways incredibly impressive. But she definitely has views that are not within the mainstream of the left in America. She does not represent the Democratic Party on average. AOC definitely does not represent the Democratic Party on average, but Biden does. And so let's look at the Republican Party. Trump is the Republican Party. They almost all of them, with a few exceptions, try to follow him, except for a handful of people, most of whom have been retired or driven out of the party, essentially. So what's happened is the entire political order has been upended. And we have a number of forces, whether it's horrible media coverage being totally out of touch with the reality on the ground of how most people think and feel, pushing very far left candidates and a level of wokeness and kind of an intolerant pursuit of racial justice, I would argue. As a white guy, I don't care if I'm reading the New York Times. And because I think, first of all, I hope I'm not trying to offend anybody here, but I think white people that take pride in being white and identify in an emotional sense as white are pathetic, and they have very little else in their lives or identities that they can hold on to. And it's just sad. And I get it. I have sympathy for these people, but to me, it's pathetic. It's one thing if you're celebrating Irish pride or Italian pride or Polish pride, but like clinging to whiteness is just absurd. Okay, so I am not offended by this, but the New York Times style has recently been updated to capitalize black and to not capitalize white. Now, first of all, I think there's a lot of problems with this for various reasons. Of course, you would always capitalize African American or Jamaican American or Caribbean American or Nigerian American, okay? And African American in particular generally refers to the slave descent population, the people that are descended from people who were brought over in chains and have a very specific history and context, and they were different ethnicities from different parts of Africa, but then they were sadly and disgustingly bred like animals, and it's very hard for any of these people, unless they're doing DNA tests and Ancestry.com stuff, they don't know their history in terms of where in Africa they came from. They weren't able to have family units that preserved that. These families were ripped apart, sold, beaten, worked to death like animals, and we have this superhuman kind of, it's why the Kenyan team or the Nigerian basketball team are never going to, 9 times out of 100 beat the American basketball team, because our African American athletes were the product of literally breeding like only the strongest survived these absolutely brutal conditions. And you had a lot of physically very dominant body types and genes that were passed on and bred selectively the way people breed horses. It's disgusting, okay? But African Americans are a particular group, special group of kind of artificially created ethnicity because of slavery. But Nigerians and the different ethnicities within Nigeria and other parts, those are all distinct as well. And they're kind of on par with each other. Like the Nigerian American community is what it is, and African Americans from the slave descent population is very distinct from that, as are people that are emigrating from the Caribbean and other places, Sudan, South Africa, what have you, to the United States. These are all very distinct groups. So the idea from the New York Times is that, well, black in America means something, but white in America it doesn't have the same level of kind of special meaning. And I'd argue, I met with an Ethiopian acquaintance not too long ago. I'll be honest, it was a date. But we were talking about this, and she's like, yeah, I don't get the whole African-American thing, the whole being black in America thing. It just is so different from what I'm used to growing up in Ethiopia. I don't really identify with this experience. And that's not to say that all black people to some degree don't generally experience as a group and individually levels of racism that are directed at them just because of the color of their skin. But in terms of the lived experience of racism, the history of Jim Crow and slavery and all that versus a Nigerian engineer who comes to the United States. Nigerian immigrants, for example, are better educated than most Americans, than white Americans are on average. Bet you didn't know that. But and a number of other African immigrants, and I think Caribbean immigrants too. Pew has some very interesting stuff on this. I'll include a link as well. But the point is, I'm not a white man who cares on a personal level and any emotional way, I have any sense of pride or being offended. I don't care at all that the New York Times has decided to capitalize black and not capitalize white. It's absolutely asinine, though, and stupid, because the very people that the New York Times really needs to reach with information that they are not getting because they are consuming right-wing propaganda in a cultish manner. The very people that they most need to have read their newspaper for the sake of the country, for the sake of truth and understanding, will absolutely see that and be so deeply offended and feel like the caricature, nonsense, completely insane concept that in general the left and Democrats are trying to have minorities take the country over and destroy white culture and white people and to tear them down and to discriminate against them, which is, believe it or not, what a lot of white conservatives think. A lot, like way too many. Like I believe, well, from multiple polls, over half of Republicans or about half of Republicans. And actually, it might be significantly more of Republicans now that I think about it. I'll try to find some of that data and include that as well. But the point is, when the New York Times does this, when other outlets are kind of rightfully emphasizing and presenting the unique and harder struggle on average that especially African-American slave descent people, but also any immigrants of color, any immigrants in general, but any immigrants for the most that aren't like the doctors and the engineers, but immigrants of color, women, there is very much a hierarchy in the United States. White privilege is a real thing. I prefer the term white advantage. I think that's something that will create less hostility among certain people that need to really recognize this concept for what it is, mainly white people, right? But there's certainly a privilege that even the poorest whites have on average that the poorest blacks and even some of the less poor blacks will never experience. Especially, and this comes to a lot of what's going on now, the treatment of people of color and particularly black people and black men by the police and the criminal justice system. And we could do a whole episode on that, and you know what, we will. But what's happening is that reality is being destroyed. And this goes to Putin, this goes to the Russian campaign to absolutely produce false equivalence and confusion on just about everything so that doesn't really matter. Nobody's better than anybody else. So how can you criticize what Russia does? How can you criticize Vladimir Putin when America does this and this country does that and blah, 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 blah. And that's absurd because scale matters, intention matters, the effect of what you do matters. But this disinformation campaign by both internationally, the Russians and their huge global network, and domestically, the Republicans. Their assault on truth and objectivity and reality, their embracing of mindless conspiracy theories that prey on the worst of our anti-Semitic and racist prejudices, and sexist prejudices, and just this whole assault on truth. If the quote-unquote liberal, really the mainstream, the liberal media, we're talking like to some degree MSNBC, but they still have a lot of high standards there as far as sticking to facts on a lot of stuff. I'm talking like Truth Out, The Intercept, Salon, like, there's a lot of outlets out there that are, El Chapo Trap House, that nonsense. But, lots of people like this stuff, right? That's the real liberal media. We have a centrist media that embraces certain liberal values of advancing social, racial, economic, gender justice, right? Acknowledging the reality that women and people of color and poor people are discriminated against and that they deserve more attention, and that we need to do things to actively advance their rights, not just say, let's not discriminate. No, you have to lift up groups that have been held down. Because even if they lift themselves up, the people who had the advantages that weren't being held down are still going to always be ahead on average. So I get it. The way the media, though, is doing this is coming off as incredibly partisan. I'm not saying the general substance of a lot of how this coverage is, but I'm saying the way that they present it, it comes off very much like they are advocates for liberals and Democrats. And then the worst part about this is that they're sort of conscious of this. So to make up for it, they'll spend like way too much time talking about Hillary Clinton's emails, or way too much time talking about this verbal flub of Biden's that doesn't reflect his career or life, whereas Trump's almost Tourette's-like dropping of racist and sexist and disparaging comments absolutely reflects his career and pattern of who he is as a person. So those are legitimate stories to focus on, whereas if we look at these flubs and misstatements, and honestly, I'll put these articles as well in our list. You got Biden's stuttering, which he overcame to agree by having certain mental exercises with how he would address speaking and whatnot, but that in his older age and under the pressure now, those are not as effective. And so a good part of his misstatements are related to how he coped with stuttering. And to a degree, he hasn't overcome it currently as much as he wants to admit. He's a proud guy, and I don't blame him. He's proud to have overcome that. He should be proud to have overcome that horrible stutter he had as a kid. But it's affecting the way he speaks, and a lot of his worst moments are related to a large degree to that, and I'm going to be posting the articles that explain that as well. But instead, I'll give you an example. And, The Daily Show, yeah, it's comedy, but it does have a responsibility to try to present something of a accurate picture as well, because that's what it has become. That's what Jon Stewart transformed it to. It's not just lowbrow comedy. It's a lot more than that. Trevor Noah's Daily Show put out this thing where, like, yeah, Biden sucks, but he's not as bad as Trump. And I'm sorry, but that's just not, narrated by Steve Buscemi. And it was funny, and it took a lot of the worst moments that you could find from Biden on the trail. Fine. It is what it is, but it's not representative of who he is. And that's what I don't like, is that a lot of these kind of outlets that appeal to younger people never give a balanced presentation of some of these really hardworking, more centrist politicians who, I'm sorry, the only way you get stuff done is by compromising. And I was talking with some people earlier about this, but think about someone who really cares about these causes and has to compromise on something. They don't want to. They have to give up making a certain amount of progress on a certain issue to get votes to make that progress actually happen, right? They have to give certain things up that they don't want to give up. And it hurts. It's painful. They really care about this. They want to do more, but there's only so much you can do in a democratic, decentralized federal system where there's people who vehemently disagree with you and are only going to go so far. So how do you get that passed? You don't do what Bernie does, which is talk and moralize and lecture and virtue signal for 30 years from Congress. The guy's passed about 7 bills, and 2 of them were renaming post offices, and the only majorly substantive bill that he's really taking credit for the last time I looked, and I'll double check this, I'll get back to you in a future podcast on it. I'll look at all the bills he's authored and passed. The VA bill he did with McCain, the Veterans Affairs Bureau. Department of Veterans Affairs, basically the health care for veterans and all that, was very much a watered-down compromise bill that he reached with McCain. Absolutely not the revolutionary change and political revolution that he's always talking about, that he's never, ever been able to deliver on in his 3 decades in Congress. He has been ineffective and unable to do the types of things that he's talking about. Joe Biden, throughout his career, has been able to do the types of things he's talking about. And no, he did not single-handedly write the crime bill. He did not single-handedly approve or was responsible for the worst provisions of that bill. And it always gets presented as somehow that's the case, which is absurd. And that bill was overwhelmingly supported by the African-American leadership throughout the country, mayors, state legislators, Congress people at the time, the Congressional Black Caucus, a whole bunch of people. So, I mean, there's a lot of revisionist history going on with how this has been presented. But anyway, the point is, all that stuff I mentioned to you, the mainstream media, the New York Times, they did not present a nuanced discussion over what happened with that crime bill. Since it came up so much, they should have done an entire hour-long special on this crime bill. That never happened. It just didn't happen. The same way when there was all this mindless speculation about various vice presidential candidates that Biden was considering. Really, the 2 final candidates were Susan Rice and Kamala Harris. And I still wrote the most in-depth and one of the only actual attempts to compare their careers before that announcement was announced. Why on earth am I just some independent person here, the only person to really do this? There was so much ink and so many articles and segments done on Kamala Harris and Susan Rice and yada, yada, yada. Well, let's look at them. Let's stack them up. Let's see who did more and what, and who's more exceptional and who has a better resume. I mean, why on earth is there not room for anything like that in the modern media landscape? It's honestly pathetic. We're not giving people any kind of in-depth exploration. Like I said, we're throwing these puzzle pieces at people over and over again, and we actually have a chance to inform people, to say this is what really matters here. And yeah, that requires judgment and experience that like the younger, reporters aren't going to have. But that's the whole point of experience. You need to have someone that understands the historical context of some of this stuff, not just what they were told reading activist left-wing or right-wing media. I mean, and don't even get me started on the right. There is almost no more journalism on the right. Like, Chris Wallace is on a sinking ship. Don't love Chris Wallace. I've had issues with him before, but he's easily one of the only people trying to do in his mind. And I mean, he's definitely a conservative. He has his biases as a conservative, but within that frame, he tries to do his job seriously. He's one of the only really and my hat's off to him, even though I was throwing some shade at him. The point is, there are so few people at Fox or any of these right-wing publications that are even operating within reality, let alone any serious effort to be objective. So, and you can still be an advocate. You can be adversarial, but you've got to do that within an approach of fairness. Something approaching fairness, I should say. So, yeah, this was a little less organized than I was hoping, but this is my first in a very long time outfit. I'm going to try to keep these all to under an hour, ideally even a little less, but I'll let this one go a little longer since, I'm not going to talk about myself with the royal we, goodness. I've been absent from this for a while, and I was kind of introducing myself and my site and the type of content you're going to be getting here. But, like I said, let's go back to this journey of how we got to where we are, and where we're going. And the media did an absolutely horrible job covering the 2016 election. They equated Hillary's emails, which was the most, in my entire life, I've never seen a more ink devoted to something that came up with nothing. day in, day out. I vaguely remember the media coverage of the Clinton impeachment stuff, and that was very salacious stuff, and of course it was. I don't remember day in, day out that many, and granted there weren't as many media outlets, and maybe it's somewhat similar, pound for pound adjusted or whatever, but even the Clinton impeachment, like the different aspects of impeachment, like that was serious, that was impeachment. Some of the substance was ridiculous, but there was perjury involved, there was an affair involved. With the Hillary Clinton email server and the emails themselves and all that, there was literally nothing of consequence or substance in terms of a detrimental effect on people to have come out of any of this. And that's after, like, I think 8 investigations, many of which were authored or led by Republicans, and the amount of ink that this got, all right? So let's look at what happened. If you had a normal election absent any of these, pick one of these, any one of these, Clinton wins, okay? But you had really myopic media coverage that was, even to the extent that they were revisiting Bill Clinton's old sex scandals. You had about 24 women from Trump with accusing Trump of sexual assault or rape. About 24 women. That's a lot. And they didn't have any of the credibility issues that some of Clinton's accusers had, not all. But so far, I have yet to see any reporting that's uncovered verifiable issues of credibility with any of Trump's accusers. And yet, and think about all the other crazy things that were going on with Russia and all the different things he was saying in Trump's businesses. I uncovered things about Trump's businesses that the mainstream press barely talked about. Or if they did, they didn't put anything together to show what's really a horrible pattern of involvement with the Russian mafia and organized crime and cheating out contractors and investors and what have you, and absolute dismal failures, bankruptcies. I'll have to double check this, but I'm pretty sure both Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers were kind of screwed by Trump just before they went under in the 2008 crisis. Trump literally was a significant factor in precipitating the failure of 2 of the main institutions that caused the giant meltdown of the world economy in 2008. I'm not kidding. And I have written about this, and I will post the information from that. Some of it's from an ebook that you'd have to buy, but I might post the excerpt or a screenshot of it for you guys at some point. But the media coverage was just so myopic and not balanced in any way, as in properly weighing the importance of things, because Hillary Clinton's emails, and this is also in my work and I'll put that out, but that was covered more than any other single scandal by far, than almost all of Donald Trump's other scandals combined. That one issue. And again, this is the press being sensitive to criticism that they're liberal and they're not fair. So they overcompensate because, frankly, these days the left does not have nearly as many scandals. And they're not as bad even when they do have them. And they overcompensate by trying to show that they're quote-unquote fair by covering these other scandals when they just don't deserve that kind of coverage. It's not that they shouldn't be covered at all. It's that they're just not on the same level. So that was one factor. You had the Russian government, including military intelligence, and intelligence from a successor group to the KGB, the famed Soviet KGB. You have them hacking the Democrats and Hillary's campaign manager, and then weaponizing that information to do maximum damage at just the right time, both during the convention when she needs to bring the Bernie people on board, and all they got from that was some DNC staffers privately among themselves didn't like the guy who was refusing to be a Democrat and called himself a Democratic Socialist instead, who was trying to hijack the party. Oh, they said some mean things about him privately. Who cares? That's politics. It's as normal as anything in politics. You had that, and you had WikiLeaks, right? So you had horrible media coverage. You had the Russian government, including Russian intelligence agencies and other propaganda arms. You had the sexism that came along in general throughout society and coverage that accompanied Clinton in a way no other major party nominee, ever had to deal with. So media coverage, Russian government, you had WikiLeaks acting as a foreign hostile intelligence agency trying to smear Clinton. You had sexism. You had the Comey letter just before. I mean, that was so ridiculous. I cannot believe that Comey could be so. I think Comey meant well. I think he thought Hillary had it and that wouldn't make a difference, and he didn't want the FBI to look bad, but he was so protective of the FBI that he wasn't protective enough about the entire election process and American democracy. So he really wasn't seeing, he missed the forest for the trees, or whatever that expression is. He really dropped the ball on that. So you add all those things together, right? That's a lot. All of those things are things that no other candidate has ever had to deal with. Hillary Clinton dealt with all of those, and she still won by almost 3 million votes. And as I noted, it came down to about 38,000 votes spread over, because it's not that number they always throw out there. That's the margin in each state, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. You just needed half plus one to switch from that margin to Clinton. We're not even talking about the third-party votes right now, by the way, in terms of the gap between Clinton and Trump. But you just needed about 38,000 votes in those 3 states to have switched from somebody else to Clinton, from Gary Johnson, from Jill Stein, or Trump to Clinton. And Jill Stein alone was more than twice the gap in each of those states. I'll just mention the gap between the Jill Stein votes alone were more than twice the gap between Clinton and Trump in each of those 3 states. So you're telling me with this amazing cyber warfare campaign that was planned well over a year in advance, you're telling me that the FBI meddling, WikiLeaks, and the horribly myopic coverage of the media and the sexism. Let's forget about the myopic coverage isn't unique to Clinton. All right, so although to some degree it is actually, because that's in big part a result of the sexism that she had as much scrutiny. There still would have been some of that issue, but you look at all that, and that's how close it was. So, and Trump, won. And that's how we got to that. And then where we are now is that the Republican Party has absolutely no spine, that the MAGA crowd, the Make America Great Again crowd, the far-right media, not just Fox, but a whole bunch of others, they absolutely have demanded loyalty to this cult-like figure of Trump. And any Republican that comes out to criticize him gets smashed. So many of them, Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, Will Hurd, Charlie Dent, there's just so many different Republicans who were like, you know what, I'm out. The better ones, the ones that, Mitt Romney is one of the only ones who consistently is still in office and comes out against him. And I was so touched that he did what he did that I cried. So there's that. But so Mitt Romney, all right, going back to impeachment, by the way, he voted yes on one article, and let's see. I don't know. I'll get back to you on. I'm pretty sure Mitt Romney was the only Republican that voted for any. I have to check it. Yep, just Mitt Romney. So literally, only one Republican senator of over 50. That tells you everything you need to know about the Republican Party right now. Because what was amazing about this, where we are now, is Orwellian Soviet apparatchik dystopia, and this is before the coronavirus, where Trump is telling you that the virus is going away when it's not. Not just once, but like almost daily. But what we have is a party that absolutely operates like a cult. It doesn't stand up to Trump at all. It doesn't, I mean, the one big exception was the horrible situation with the Kurdish pullout and the pullout that decimated the Kurds in northern Syria. We'll do a whole episode on that at some point. But yeah, there's no real sense of truth left with the Republican Party. I mean, they literally went to the Senate during the impeachment trial and denied that Trump did what he said he did. He literally admitted that he did it, and they denied that he did it, and then they peddled made up fake information peddled by the Russian government, Kremlin propaganda and disinformation about Joe Biden's son. This is reality in 2020, right? And then look where we are with the coronavirus, right? So we have a president that's been decimating the expertise of different agencies, ignoring reality, ignoring the facts, ignoring the experts. And what I've been saying ever since Trump got elected was, listen, maybe you think things aren't that bad now. Wait until Trump really has any significant major challenge that requires him to do a good job on something big. We're all screwed. The moment that happens. And we lucked out for most of his first term, we didn't have anything that absolutely demanded, at least for how people were dealing with things at home. Abroad's a little different. He's really made things bad abroad. And he's made things bad at home too. But in a way that the average person would see it affecting their lives when essentially the Obama recovery was limping along in the Trump era. I said, you think it's not bad now because he hasn't been able to, really affect things the way he wants to. I mean, we had heroes like John McCain helping preserve Obamacare. John McCain's dead now. Okay? One of the only other Republicans to stand up to Trump. But the Republicans tried to get rid of Obamacare, and Trump didn't have quite enough power yet to do it. There's just a couple of people that were a thorn in his side, but they were able to stop it. That won't happen in the second term if he wins. But thankfully, most Americans could get by if they just ignored his stupidity and his tweets and his garbage that came out of his mouth on a regular basis. You could kind of be living your life in this economy. And if you were really poor or you were an immigrant and you were one of those kids don't get me started on the kids in the cages thing, okay? That was so disgusting. But for most Americans, you could kind of create this illusion that, oh, things aren't that bad for me, so he must not be doing that bad. And all the while, the groundwork, I should say, the foundations were being obliterated that were preventing many horrible things from happening that were going to affect all of us. And so Trump is unique in that he set up what has happened with coronavirus so perfectly through so many of the decisions he made and that his Republican enablers allowed to happen, whether it's the getting rid of the pandemic task force that Obama created, getting funding to the health organizations of the federal government, getting the agencies that would be supporting and the programs that would be supporting people hardest hit by this, weaponizing reality and media to the point that, people are just not going to accept the truth on coronavirus and that it's become a political issue to even wear a mask during a pandemic. All these things are Trump didn't necessarily start these trends, but he moved forward effectively behind the scenes in ways that we weren't paying attention to. But believe me, the effects are being felt now. And this is just his first major test. Imagine if something crazy happens in the next 4 years and this guy's still in charge. We're not going to make it, guys. I'm not saying we're all going to die. I'm just going to say this system, our government, democracy itself, as far as being a real democracy, not a majoritarian, authoritarian system like Erdogan in Turkey or Putin in Russia, where, yeah, there's elections, but same people stay in power. They cheat. They treat the opposition unfairly. Yeah, who cares, right? And I'm being sarcastic. I care. And we all should care. But the point is, destroying the rule of law, destroying the agencies as far as being objective enforcers of executive branch actions of the laws passed by Congress. Whether it's William Barr here with the Department of Justice or Mike Pompeo with the State Department, we are really in trouble. And coronavirus has simply exposed how absolutely uniquely, horribly suited Trump is to this job, and how much damage he has been able to do that we just weren't aware of because we didn't need him and the federal government to support us in the way that we do now. And now, in the Western world, we have the worst situation with the coronavirus, period. We're the only Western country that never really flattened the curve. We bent it down a bit and then reopened way too early and got a whole big other bump, and that's why we're approaching 200,000 coronavirus deaths in something like a week. Or less than a week, maybe even just a few days. So that's where we are. Where are we going? We're on a cliff, folks. And this is going to be the end of my podcast now, but we're on a cliff. Where we're going is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are like, in some ways, and if you think this sounds hyperbolic, we will definitely be getting into this in the future, but the last hope for Western civilization and Western democracy to survive as we know it. To survive in the image of the post-World War II order that rejected fascism and that united to contain and eventually defeat communism. That international world order made in the image of the United States, but that extended our former enemies, Japan and Germany, among others. That brought unprecedented prosperity and peace to Japan and Germany since the end of World War II. That order that has lifted billions out of extreme poverty, whatever anyone wants to say about quote-unquote neoliberal world order, the numbers are all there, folks. You can't argue with them. Doesn't mean that everything about the post-war U.S.-led system is perfect. Far from it. There's many problems, and we did a lot of horrible things during the Cold War that I will not dispute or defend. Or at least on balance defend. But the point is, we are at a crossroads, and the future is a descent into neo, proto, whatever you want to call it, a new form of fascism that doesn't rely primarily on violence to come to power, but uses other things. A new form of fascism that will dominate the West. It's already rising in Europe. We've already seen Hungary fall to it. Poland's falling to it. Britain, because of it, committed something of a mortal, or at least a critical blow to itself in the whole Brexit process. Other countries, there's some really ugly far-right movements on the cusp or sharing power. Italy's really scary when you look at the parties running Italy now. If the U.S. falls to Trump again, and Putin and others get to just do what they want around the world, not face that many consequences, the Western democratic international order that we've seen that spread to parts of Asia, saw Nelson Mandela rise to power. We're in trouble, folks. We really are. It's either democracy has a shot to renew itself and survive, Western democracy as we know it, that respects minority rights, that respects the rule of law, that it's not simply the majority get to vote to do whatever they want, and then the organs of government enable the majority to do whatever they want, and then they oppress the minority however they want. This is what the segregated South was, the Jim Crow, after the white supremacist terrorist movements overthrew the biracial Reconstruction governments after the Civil War. That's the kind of thing we're looking at. That's what Erdogan's doing in Turkey. It's what Netanyahu's turning Israel into. He's not that far. Maybe he'll never go quite that far, but he's certainly moving Israel strongly in that direction. It's what happened with Hungary. It's Duterte in the Philippines. It's what Poland's becoming. It's what Italy could become. It's what Marine Le Pen wants to turn France into, who's been getting millions from the Russians. There's a lot of scary stuff going on, folks, and this moment in time, it's truly a fork in the road. I know a lot of people made fun of John Kasich at the DNC, but the imagery, if not well executed and inspiring, it was perfect, because that's literally where we are, a fork in the road. And there's no middle ground. Either Trump is removed from office or Biden is installed in office. And the markedly different paths, the remarkable divergence of outcomes from those two possibilities cannot be overstated, except in the most extreme possible sense, that someone would claim that Biden winning is going to be an automatic utopia and everything will be perfect. And I love Joe Biden, and full disclosure, I interned for him back in 2006. I'm not claiming that about Biden, but I think he could be one of the best presidents we've ever had. That's a whole nother conversation. You might think I'm nuts. But if you look at the substance of the man, his heart, his willingness to work with people with different views, to embrace diversity of thought and of background, of who cares, who values expertise, this guy's going to have a team of all-stars like you won't believe. And unlike Obama, who came into office not really knowing what he was doing, relatively new to DC politics, only been in DC for 4 years as a senator, Biden is going to hit the ground running. He's not going to try to have a year's worth of conversations to figure out what to do on healthcare. He's going to have a plan that he's going to be ready to go with. He's going to already be getting all kinds of input from people, and they're going to be ready to go on day one. Paris Accord, healthcare, restoring our alliances, you name it. There's going to be so much that's going to happen in the first 2 years of a Biden administration. Your head's going to spin. And all the naysayers of Biden, as long as we can get the Senate and the House, and I'm optimistic if Biden wins, we will, we're going to see an era of American politics that we have not seen really since FDR in terms of what will be accomplished in the beginning. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm just going to say thank you very much for listening, those of you who have. This is my first foray into this. I'm going to try and keep these shorter. I said that before, though, too, with my past iteration of my podcast, and that did not happen because so much crazy stuff was going on, and here we are. But I'm going to try and keep this more focused instead of have it be a general let's riff on everything podcast. But I will have episodes that will be more general riffs, I guess, on all the things going on. But look, we've all got to learn from our mistakes, whether it's the media, whether it's liberals, whether it's conservatives. We've all got to learn from our mistakes and come correct, as they say, come November, or our democracy may die. It will be some ugly thing that will have the trappings of democracy, but it will not really be democracy in the spirit of what we've had since 1965 in this country. And that arc that Obama talked about, and Martin Luther King, the arc of justice, bending towards, a more perfect union that the founders envisioned, that so many envisioned for so long, including abolition that went back to the colonial era. Abolitionists, I meant. That arc will not be bending towards justice anymore. That arc, the totality of our direction, will be backwards, will be down. And America as we know it will not exist anymore. So those are the challenges we face, and I hope to guide you through some of these crazy things and other things going on around the world too, and in our country. And thank you for joining the Real Context News inaugural first podcast for Labor Day weekend. This is September 6th here, Sunday of Labor Day weekend. And I'm pretty excited that it seems I'm going to have a very, very special guest for possibly my next podcast. And we're going to be doing some guest discussions as well. So it's not going to be just me. For those of you who may hate my voice but love what I have to say, at least you'll get another voice that might be more pleasant to listen to than my own. And ideally some people that are far more experienced than myself. So anyway, although I'm pretty proud of my 2 decades of experience covering and writing about and researching international affairs, domestic politics, international politics, counterterrorism, security issues, diplomacy, international development, humanitarian aid. I have quite a nexus of related subjects that I'm very proud to have operated to some degree, either academically or professionally, at a high level concerning, going back to the year 2000. And, you got 2 decades of pretty solid experience from me. So there are a lot of people smarter than me, more experienced, more accomplished, but I still think I hold my own pretty well, especially against people from similar accomplishments and backgrounds. And what I would say is that, especially in the media and analyst field, if you look back at my work, and I will be posting some of this stuff tomorrow or whenever I post this podcast, but I've been way ahead of the game of most of the mainstream top tier professionals, and at least publicly releasing their work analysts. And I'm proud of that, and I just hope that we can all wise up a bit, that the media class will do a better job of seeing the big picture, because that's what really matters. Not this email or that email of Hillary Clinton's or her emails in general, but the fact that the Russian government is hacking an election and supporting one candidate over another. That's the big story, folks. And I knew that back in July 2016. The media in general did not. So anyway, I'm proud to bring my expertise and what I am really good at to you. I'm proud to hear or welcome any feedback, criticisms, hate mail, whatever. Love, praise, anything you want to send my way. I'm interested. Chances are I will respond. So my contact information for my site and whatnot will be there, also on Twitter. So any of you are welcome to join the conversation. And if we get enough people responding, we might have some segments involving responses to readers' thoughts or listeners' thoughts, I should say. But anyway, thank you again for joining the Real Context News Inaugural podcast. It's been a long day. And thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to presenting more quality content and hopefully better quality content with each progressive episode to you along the way as we live through this insane dystopian pandemic election year.